The moment I realized that smile wasn't human, I knew I was in danger. What had initially seemed like a bizarre, mildly terrifying encounter with a deeply disturbed, lost individual wandering entirely alone in the dead of the freezing night was rapidly and violently spiraling into a true horror story that I was completely, helplessly trapped inside. I had only blinked for a fraction of a second, a microscopic, completely involuntary flutter of my dry, violently burning eyelids, but in that immeasurably tiny window of absolute, blinding darkness, the pale girl in the torn, filthy white dress had somehow closed the massive physical distance between us. She was no longer standing at the far, obscured edge of the dense tree line, half swallowed by the creeping, unnatural mountain fog. She was now standing less than 10 feet away from me, perfectly and harshly illuminated by the sickly, dying yellow beam of my heavy metal flashlight. But she had made absolutely no sound. The sprawling forest floor was heavily blanketed in a thick, completely dry, decaying layer of dead autumn leaves, brittle pine twigs, and heavy, jagged rocks, a rough terrain that made it physically, fundamentally impossible for any living, breathing creature of any size to traverse without creating a loud, chaotic symphony of snapping wood and rustling debris. Yet, she had completely bypassed the immutable physical laws of reality, closing the gap with a terrifying, absolute, dead silence that completely stopped my frantic heartbeat in my chest. The heavy, ambient atmosphere of the sprawling, isolated woods began to violently, irreparably warp and severely distort around my trembling body. The towering, ancient pine trees, which had previously stood straight, tall, and imposing against the starless, black sky, now seemed to actively, aggressively lean inward, their massive, heavy branches twisting and reaching down like giant, deformed, grasping fingers completely trapping me in a tight, suffocating, inescapable wooden cage. The dense, cloying grey fog thickened exponentially, actively swallowing the faint, ambient moonlight and aggressively reducing my field of vision to the tiny, illuminated circle, casting harsh, deep shadows over her incredibly pale features. I stood completely frozen, my heavy leather boots anchored firmly to the damp, freezing earth, my entire body violently trembling as I stared directly, helplessly into her face. That's when the deeply unsettling, mind-breaking details of her physical existence finally, undeniably revealed themselves to my rapidly fracturing sanity. I knew, with a massive, freezing shockwave of pure, unadulterated primal terror tearing straight down my spine, that this was absolutely not a normal person. Her pale, perfectly smooth face was completely devoid of any natural, healthy biological flush, looking exactly like ancient, stretched parchment or cold, carved, unyielding marble left out in the freezing rain. But it was her smile that completely and utterly shattered my fragile understanding of the natural world. It was stretched far, far too wide, pulling the absolute corners of her thin, bloodless lips up at an impossible, deeply mechanical, tearing angle that entirely defied the structural limitations of human cheekbones, jawlines, and facial muscles. The flawless, frozen, unblinking smile was completely devoid of any genuine emotion, underlying warmth, or human sanity. It was a cold, calculated, highly predatory imitation of a human expression, perfectly worn as a crude, mocking, terrifying disguise. Her dark, flat, entirely dead eyes did not reflect the harsh beam of my flashlight, looking exactly like two bottomless, pitch-black voids perfectly cut into a hollow, painted mask. Her physical presence radiated a heavy, intense, deeply malicious barometric pressure that completely saturated the freezing air, actively popping my inner ears and violently squeezing the remaining precious oxygen right out of my tight, burning lungs. I desperately, pathetically tried to convince my breaking mind that this was just a severe, highly vivid hallucination, an imaginary scary story invented by my extremely exhausted, sleep-deprived brain to explain the creeping shadows, but the overwhelming, deeply physical sensation of her crushing, hostile aura proved undeniably that this was a terrifying, impossible real experience unfolding right in front of my wide, disbelieving eyes. She did not breathe. She did not shiver in the bitter, sub-zero winter wind that suddenly whipped through the clearing. She simply stood there, perfectly, impossibly still, her long, pale, multi-jointed arms hanging completely limp and lifeless at her sides. And then, the terrifying, statuesque stillness was violently broken. She took a single, slow step toward me, but she absolutely did not move like a human. There was no subtle shifting of weight, no natural bending of the knees, and no rhythmic bobbing of the shoulders. Her pale, barefoot figure simply glided smoothly and effortlessly forward over the jagged roots and dry leaves, a flawlessly terrifying, floating motion that completely and utterly confirmed my deepest, darkest fear. Whatever was currently wearing the stolen, fragile shape of a young girl was completely, categorically not human. The absolute, paralyzing spell of pure dread violently broke, instantly replaced by a massive, chaotic flood of pure, toxic, blinding adrenaline. I violently dropped my heavy flashlight, the tough metal casing hitting the damp earth with a dull, heavy thud, and the beam instantly died, plunging the clearing into absolute darkness. I blindly, frantically turned and sprinted directly into the pitch-black, suffocating abyss of the deep woods. I didn't care about the sharp, jagged branches aggressively whipping against my pale face and tearing violently into the thick fabric of my heavy winter coat. I didn't care about the unseen, exposed roots violently twisting my ankles or the freezing mud completely soaking my boots. My only desperate, consuming, singular thought was to put as much physical distance between myself and that unblinking, smiling, gliding entity as humanly possible. I ran until my chest felt like it was actively burning from the inside out, my tight, cramping lungs desperately gasping for the freezing, thin mountain air, my frantic, heavy footsteps echoing loudly and violently against the towering, silent trees. But the deeper I ran into the dense, sprawling forest, the more the physical environment seemed to aggressively twist, loop, and actively trap me. The winding, familiar dirt trail that I had successfully navigated earlier that evening completely, mysteriously vanished, entirely swallowed by an endless, identical, sprawling labyrinth of towering pines and thick, impenetrable, thorny brush. Every single direction I frantically turned looked exactly, flawlessly the same, a dark, repeating, highly disorienting mirror maze that completely destroyed my sense of direction and aggressively fed my rising panic. Time itself felt profoundly, terrifyingly broken, stretching agonizing, frantic seconds into endless, suffocating hours of pure psychological torture. I was completely, hopelessly lost in the dark, spinning wildly in the freezing fog, but that wasn't the absolute worst part. Despite my frantic, desperate, chaotic sprinting, the heavy, dead, terrifying silence of the isolated woods was constantly, relentlessly pressing against my back like a massive, physical weight. I could not hear her footsteps behind me because she inherently did not make any sound, but I could physically, undeniably feel the crushing, massive, freezing weight of her unblinking, pitch-black gaze firmly locked onto the absolute back of my neck. I knew, with a cold, sickening, absolute certainty, that something followed me into the dark, effortlessly pacing my desperate, exhausting flight without ever breaking a sweat, taking a single breath, or snapping a single twig. The intense, overwhelming pressure of being actively, malevolently hunted in the pitch-black night by an apex predator that fundamentally did not follow the laws of physics slowly began to completely break my exhausted mind. I stumbled violently over a massive, unseen, moss-covered log, crashing heavily and painfully into the freezing, damp mud, completely tearing the fragile skin off my trembling palms. I scrambled desperately onto my back like a cornered animal, kicking wildly away from the creeping shadows, entirely expecting to see that impossible, stretched, tearing smile looming directly over me in the pitch-black darkness, her pale hands reaching out to finally drag me into the earth. But the woods were completely, entirely empty. I was completely alone in the freezing, dead, static silence. I slowly, painfully forced myself back onto my trembling, exhausted feet, my entire body completely covered in cold sweat and freezing mud, and I blindly stumbled forward, my vision swimming with dark, heavy spots. I pushed through a final, dense thicket of freezing briars and miraculously, inexplicably breached the edge of the dense tree line, violently bursting out onto the empty, dark, cracked asphalt of the rural mountain highway. My abandoned car was sitting exactly where I had frantically left it, the engine completely dead, bathed in the pale, silver moonlight. I frantically fumbled with my metal keys, the jagged edges cutting deeply into my shaking, bleeding fingers, and threw myself into the driver's seat, instantly slamming down the manual locks with a loud, mechanical click that echoed sharply in the quiet night. I aggressively started the engine, the loud roar of the motor finally breaking the suffocating silence, threw the heavy vehicle into drive, and sped recklessly down the winding, dark mountain road. I was absolutely, completely terrified to look back in the rearview mirror, completely convinced that if I did, I would see her pale, unblinking, smiling face pressed completely flat against the cold back glass of my car. Living through a true horror story permanently and irreparably fractures your core understanding of the natural, safe world, leaving you with a deep, lingering, highly toxic paranoia that completely poisons every single quiet moment of your existence. This is a real experience that simply refuses to fade into a manageable memory. It has been exactly 3 endless, agonizing days since that terrifying night in the woods. I am currently sitting perfectly, rigidly still in my worn leather armchair in the dead, exact center of my locked, isolated living room. Every single window blind in the house is pulled tightly shut. The heavy oak front door is firmly secured with 3 heavy, solid brass deadbolts. But the absolute, dead, suffocating silence inside my house feels exactly, flawlessly identical to the heavy, oppressive, static silence of those endless, twisting woods. The ambient, comforting sounds of the quiet neighborhood, the distant traffic, the barking dogs, the wind in the trees, have completely, entirely faded away, completely swallowed by the exact same unnatural, plunging barometric pressure that had violently popped my inner ears in the forest. The long, stretching shadows in the corners of my living room seem to be actively pooling and leaning inward, exactly like the heavy branches of the ancient pines. I am entirely, completely terrified to move a single, violently aching muscle, to turn on a single warm light, or to even draw a deep, natural breath. I am no longer entirely, confidently sure if I ever actually manage to escape that sprawling, dark labyrinth of ancient pine trees, or if my severely traumatized, fracturing mind simply fabricated a desperate, comforting illusion of safety, a fake house, and a fake escape while my physical body is still hopelessly, endlessly running in the freezing dark. I do not know if that pale, unblinking, smiling entity is still standing patiently out there in the freezing mountain fog, waiting silently for another lost traveler to wander off the path. Or, God help me, I do not know if the heavy, oppressive, freezing sensation aggressively pressing against my back right now means that she successfully, silently followed me all the way home, entirely bypassed the heavy locks, and is currently standing perfectly still in the pitch-black shadows directly behind my chair, her impossible, inhuman smile stretching wider and wider in the dark. Some stories do not end when the video does, and not every truth wants to be found. This is a true horror story about the night I realized something was inside my house, and I wasn't alone. Welcome to Shadow Tale Archives, where real stories hide in the dark, waiting to be uncovered. Some are forgotten. Some are buried. And some are still watching. My name is Arthur, and for the past 7 years, I have lived entirely by myself in a sprawling, slightly outdated, single-story craftsman home located at the very end of a deeply isolated, dead-end road in the rural, heavily forested outskirts of the Pacific Northwest. The sprawling neighborhood is completely surrounded by thick, towering acres of ancient pine trees, creating a massive, natural, impenetrable barrier that effectively swallows any ambient noise from the distant, winding highway. I have always been a naturally solitary, deeply introverted person, and I genuinely used to find a profound, deeply comforting sense of peace in the absolute, unbroken isolation of my remote home, especially during the late, quiet, uninterrupted hours of the night. When the sun finally set behind the massive, dark tree line, my house became a safe, highly secure, impenetrable sanctuary where the chaotic demands of the outside world simply ceased to exist. I would spend my long, quiet evenings reading heavy novels in the dim, warm, yellow glow of a single floor lamp in my living room, completely secure in the undeniable, deeply comforting knowledge that no one would ever wander down my remote street by accident. But a comfortable, quiet isolation is an incredibly fragile, delicate illusion, entirely dependent on the firm, unshakable belief that you are completely alone in the dark. People often actively search the internet to listen to a scary story late at night to experience a brief, highly entertaining thrill, a temporary, entirely safe spike of adrenaline before comfortably retreating into the warm security of their locked bedrooms. But when the very walls of your safe, private sanctuary are quietly, inexplicably breached, it becomes a terrifying real experience that fundamentally and irreparably shatters your core understanding of the natural, logical, safe world. It was a bitterly cold, completely windless Tuesday night in late November. The temperature had plummeted significantly just after dusk, leaving a thick, glittering layer of heavy white frost covering the dying grass in my front yard and creeping slowly up the extreme edges of the living room window panes. I was sitting perfectly, comfortably still in my worn leather recliner, deeply immersed in my book, entirely enjoying the profound, undisturbed stillness of the isolated house. The digital clock resting on the wooden mantel above the cold, empty fireplace glowed with a harsh, piercing red light, displaying exactly 1:14 a.m. The heavy, ambient silence of the house was deeply familiar, a comforting blanket of absolute quiet. But something wasn't right. The natural, ambient, comforting background noises of the old craftsman house slowly began to completely fade away. The low, familiar, mechanical hum of the kitchen refrigerator compressor abruptly and violently cut out. The rhythmic, gentle, natural settling creaks of the old wooden floorboards completely ceased. Even the faint, distant, brushing sound of the freezing winter wind moving through the high pine branches outside simply died. The entire sprawling property was violently plunged into a deafening, heavy, static void of absolute, terrifying silence. It felt exactly as if the barometric air pressure in the living room had suddenly, aggressively dropped, pressing a heavy, invisible weight against my inner eardrums and making the cold, stagnant air feel impossibly thick and difficult to breathe. I slowly lowered my heavy book, placing it silently onto the wooden side table, my heart beginning to beat with a frantic, uneven, heavy rhythm against my tight ribs. I couldn't explain it. There was absolutely no logical, rational reason for the sudden, massive spike of primal, unadulterated anxiety aggressively washing over my exhausted body, but I felt an intense, undeniable, deeply physical sensation that the dark, empty, pitch-black corners of my own living room were suddenly, malevolently watching me. I desperately tried to rationally dismiss the creeping, ice-cold dread, forcefully blaming the heavy paranoia on extreme physical exhaustion and the deeply isolating, lonely nature of the late winter hour. I slowly pushed myself out of the deep leather recliner, my bare feet sinking quietly into the thick, woven area rug, and decided to walk into the dark kitchen to grab a glass of cold tap water before finally locking the doors and going to sleep. The long, central hallway connecting the living room to the rest of the house was completely, entirely dark, illuminated only by the sickly, pale, silver moonlight filtering weakly through the kitchen window blinds at the far end of the corridor. As I stepped onto the cold, hard linoleum floor of the kitchen, a sharp, freezing chill violently ran straight up my spine. I reached my trembling hand up toward the wooden cabinet to grab a heavy glass. That's when I noticed it. The heavy, solid oak dining chair positioned at the far end of the small, round wooden kitchen table was pulled out entirely, angled sharply and unnaturally toward the dark hallway. I am an incredibly meticulous, deeply organized, highly routine-oriented person who lives entirely alone without any pets. I subconsciously, rigidly, and perfectly push every single wooden chair firmly under the edge of the table every single time I walk past it. It was a small, seemingly insignificant, mundane detail, but the horrifying sight of that heavily angled wooden chair sent a freezing, massive shockwave of pure, unadulterated dread straight down my spine. The creeping, sickening realization that there was something in my house instantly paralyzed my freezing lungs. I stood completely frozen in the dim, silver moonlight, my trembling hands slick with cold sweat, desperately trying to convince my rapidly fracturing, panicked mind that I had simply, carelessly forgotten to push the heavy chair back in earlier that evening after eating dinner. I forcefully swallowed the hard, dry lump of pure terror in my throat, slowly filled my glass with cold tap water, and turned off the metal faucet. The sudden, violent absence of the rushing water plunging the dark kitchen back into that terrifying, suffocating, dead silence was incredibly jarring. I took a slow, deep, trembling breath, tightened my clammy grip on the cold glass, and slowly began the short, dark, agonizing walk back down the long central hallway toward my master bedroom. The hallway is long, narrow, and deeply shadowed, lined entirely with 3 closed, heavy wooden doors leading to a guest bathroom, an empty home office, and a small, deep storage closet. As I slowly walked past the dark, closed door of the empty home office, my bare feet sliding silently and carefully across the polished, freezing hardwood floor, I felt an intense, overwhelming, and highly unnatural compulsion to completely stop moving. The fine hairs on the very back of my neck stood straight up, and my pale skin completely erupted in freezing, painful goosebumps. I felt a heavy, intense, deeply malicious presence pressing aggressively against the stagnant air directly behind the thick wood of the office door. It was the undeniable, highly paralyzing, physical sensation of an unseen, unblinking gaze meticulously tracking my exact movements from the pitch-black shadows of the unused room. I should have left the hallway immediately, bolted directly into my bedroom, and locked the heavy door, but I didn't. I stood perfectly, rigidly still in the pitch-black corridor, my back pressed tightly against the cold, painted drywall, holding my breath so tightly my lungs burned as I listened intensely to the suffocating, heavy void. I slowly, carefully lowered my wide, burning, terrified gaze to the polished hardwood floor illuminated by the ambient moonlight. The thick, woven, heavy runner rug that spanned the entire length of the hallway was violently, aggressively bunched up directly in front of the closed home office door, pushed hard against the baseboard exactly as if someone had hurriedly, forcefully pivoted on their heavy heel to slip silently inside the dark room just mere seconds before I walked by. I do not shuffle my heavy feet when I walk, and I had absolutely, categorically not walked down this specific section of the dark hallway since early yesterday afternoon. The creeping, sickening, mind-numbing paralysis actively and violently anchored my freezing bare feet to the cold floorboards. This wasn't a bizarre trick of an exhausted, sleep-deprived mind, and it wasn't a nightmare, it was a true horror story actively, violently unfolding right in the assumed safety of my own isolated home, a dark, impossible reality bleeding aggressively into my quiet, mundane life. The psychological pressure radiating violently through the solid wood of the closed office door was immense, an overwhelming, crushing, deeply physical weight that completely saturated the stagnant, freezing air and actively, aggressively attacked my rapidly fracturing, exhausted sanity. I desperately wanted to call out into the dark, to violently demand to know exactly who or what was hiding in the pitch-black shadows of my home, to scream at the absolute top of my lungs for anyone to help me, but my vocal cords were completely, entirely paralyzed by a primal, deeply buried, ancient survival instinct that violently ordered me to remain completely silent and entirely unseen in the dark. The absolute, mind-shattering certainty that there was something in my house, something completely unknown and uninvited patiently watching me from the dark shadows just inches away, completely and utterly destroyed any lingering, pathetic hope of safety or rational explanation. Living through a true horror story permanently and irreparably fractures your core understanding of the natural, safe world, leaving you with a deep, lingering, highly toxic paranoia that completely poisons every single quiet moment of your existence. I knew that this terrifying real experience was far from over, and I was completely, helplessly trapped inside a dead, isolated house with absolutely no immediate avenue of escape. I slowly, carefully, agonizingly backed away from the violently bunched up rug, my heart hammering violently and painfully against my tight ribs exactly like a trapped, panicked bird. I absolutely did not want to turn my vulnerable back to that closed, heavy wooden door. I didn't want to make a single, microscopic, perceptible sound that would alert the intruder to my exact physical position. I slowly slid my freezing feet backward until my shaking shoulders finally bumped against the wooden doorframe of my master bedroom at the very end of the hall. I stepped silently backward into the dark, shadowed threshold, completely consumed by the heavy, oppressive, suffocating tension saturating the dead air. I stood perfectly still in the darkness of my bedroom, my wide, unblinking eyes locked intensely onto the closed office door at the other end of the dark hallway. And then, the dead, heavy, pressurized, suffocating silence of the isolated house was suddenly, violently, and irreparably shattered. From directly behind the closed, heavy wooden door of the dark home office, a room that had been completely empty, locked, and entirely unused for over 6 months, I clearly, undeniably heard the distinct, heavy, slow, deliberate creak of the old wooden floorboards violently compressing under the massive, shifting weight of a physical footstep. And I knew, with absolute, paralyzing, world-shattering certainty, that absolutely no one should be in there. I should have left the house, but I didn't. The deep, primal survival instinct that has successfully kept humanity alive for countless generations was violently screaming at the very back of my exhausted, sleep-deprived mind, desperately ordering me to slowly back away, unlock the heavy front door, and run blindly into the freezing, bitter night. But a heavy, completely unnatural paralysis had entirely taken hold of my cold limbs, anchoring my bare feet firmly to the polished hardwood floorboards and turning the tensed muscles in my trembling legs into solid stone. I was completely trapped in the dense, suffocating shadows of my own home, a helpless, silent observer forced to witness a true horror story unfolding in the pitch-black isolation of the late hour. The house had always been my sanctuary, a quiet, secure fortress heavily insulated against the chaotic, noisy world outside, but tonight, the familiar walls felt incredibly hostile, actively pressing inward exactly like a closing tomb. Instead of fleeing to the safety of my car, I foolishly, inexplicably decided to investigate the strange, creeping anomalies that had violently pulled me from my deep sleep. I slowly, carefully forced my heavy legs to move, my freezing feet sliding silently across the cold wood as I crept out of the living room and stepped into the long, dark central hallway. The heavy, ambient atmosphere inside the house fundamentally, violently, and irreparably shifted the exact moment I crossed the threshold. The comforting, familiar, ambient sounds of my quiet suburban home abruptly and violently ceased to exist, completely cut off exactly as if a giant, invisible, heavy switch had been forcefully thrown in the absolute dark. The low, rhythmic, comforting hum of the kitchen refrigerator compressor died instantly. The gentle, natural, settling creaks of the wooden walls completely vanished into thin air. The distant, muffled rushing sound of the freezing winter wind violently whipping against the exterior window panes was entirely swallowed by a dense, oppressive, highly unnatural void. The entire house became incredibly, impossibly silent and suffocatingly heavy, the barometric air pressure aggressively and rapidly plummeting to a severe degree that made my inner ears physically ache with a sharp, sickening, piercing pain. It felt exactly as if the entire sprawling property had been violently submerged under 1,000 feet of dark, freezing, stagnant water. It was a dead, flat, heavily pressurized, highly hostile silence that violently squeezed the remaining precious oxygen right out of my tight, cramping chest, making the frantic, uneven, terrified, booming hammering of my own heartbeat sound deafeningly, impossibly loud in my own ears. This was absolutely not a fictional scary story designed to give you a fleeting, enjoyable chill on a dark night. This was a terrifying, deeply disturbing real experience unfolding right in front of my wide, disbelieving eyes, actively tearing away the comfortable illusion of my safe, mundane reality. I reached with a trembling, clammy, sweating hand toward the wall switch, desperately hoping to flood the suffocating dark with warm, comforting artificial light. I flipped the plastic switch, but the overhead hallway bulbs did not immediately ignite with their usual soft glow. Instead, they began to violently, sporadically flicker, the electrical current aggressively buzzing and popping in the freezing air with a harsh, abrasive, highly mechanical drone that grated painfully against my eardrums. The sickly, dying amber glow cast long, jumping, deeply distorted shadows across the pale, floral wallpaper, but as I stared at the chaotic shapes widely dancing across the corridor, a profound, ice-cold dread began to pool heavily in the very bottom of my empty stomach. Something was fundamentally, deeply, and horrifyingly wrong with the shadows. They absolutely did not match the physical objects placed securely along the walls. The tall, slender shadow cast by the antique wooden grandfather clock seemed to be aggressively stretching and leaning inward at an impossible, physics-defying angle, its dark silhouette completely disconnected from the actual wooden frame, looking exactly as if it were actively trying to reach out and grab me. As I slowly, agonizingly walked past the large, ornate, silver-framed mirror hanging heavily near the guest bathroom, I involuntarily glanced at my own pale, terrified reflection in the dim, flickering light. The visual feedback was deeply unsettling, a bizarre, sickening sensory delay that made my stomach violently drop. My reflection felt incredibly heavy, reacting to my physical movements a fraction of a single second too late, exactly like watching a poorly dubbed, severely degraded film reel where the visual footage has completely slipped away from the actual timeline. When I stopped walking, the pale, terrified face in the glass took an extra, impossible moment to finally come to a complete halt. I instantly, violently looked away, completely terrified that if I stared directly into that dark glass for even one more second, the reflection would simply stop moving altogether, detach from my actions, and smile menacingly back at me. I continued my agonizingly slow, deeply terrifying walk down the twisting hallway, the freezing temperature aggressively dropping with every single, hesitant step I took. My breath was now forming thick, highly visible white clouds of condensation in the stagnant, freezing air, drifting slowly toward the ceiling like ghostly apparitions. The intense, overwhelming psychological pressure of walking entirely alone through a heavily distorted, unrecognizable version of my own home slowly began to completely break my exhausted mind. I felt an intense, overwhelming, and highly unnatural presence pressing heavily against my back. It was the undeniable, physical, terrifying sensation that something was watching me from the deep, tangled shadows I had just nervously left behind in the living room. The fine hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up like stiff wire, and my pale skin completely erupted in freezing, painful goosebumps. I slowly, carefully turned my head forward again, desperate to reach the master bedroom and lock the heavy wooden door behind me. And then, I saw it. I completely stopped breathing, my heart skipping a violent, painful beat before hammering aggressively against my ribs, flooding my tired veins with a freezing shockwave of pure, toxic adrenaline. Standing perfectly, terrifyingly still in the dark, open doorway of the bedroom at the very end of the hall was a figure. It was incredibly tall, its physical proportions heavily obscured by the pitch-black, suffocating shadows pooling densely in the threshold. It looked exactly like a massive, three-dimensional tear in the fabric of the dark night, a walking void that actively absorbed the flickering, dying amber light of the hallway bulbs. It did not have a visible face, no reflective, gleaming eyes, no pale skin, and no defining human features whatsoever. It was simply a dense, solid, impossibly dark mass shaped loosely and crudely like a towering, unnatural man. It did not move. It did not aggressively lunge forward into the light, it did not reach out its impossibly long, shadowy arms, and it absolutely did not make a single, perceptible sound. It just stood there, perfectly rigid, completely blocking the only logical path forward. The psychological pressure radiating violently from its silent, unblinking, hollow stance was immense, an overwhelming, crushing, deeply physical weight that completely saturated the stagnant, freezing air and actively, aggressively attacked my rapidly fracturing sanity. I knew, with a massive, freezing shockwave of pure, unadulterated primal terror tearing straight down my spine, that this was the absolute climax of a true horror story, the exact terrifying moment where the comfortable, logical world permanently ends and the dark, impossible reality violently takes over. Living through such a profoundly disturbing real experience actively strips away every single rational thought, leaving behind only raw, screaming, animalistic fear that entirely consumes your soul. I desperately wanted to turn around, to blindly sprint back down the flickering hallway, throw myself entirely through the heavy oak front door, and run screaming into the freezing, desolate neighborhood, but the suffocating, mind-numbing terror firmly anchored my heavy leather boots to the freezing floorboards. The towering figure did not shift its weight. It did not breathe. It just patiently, silently watched me suffer in the dim, chaotic light, projecting a highly malevolent, ancient intent that physically burned my skin. I could no longer endure the paralyzing, maddening weight of its unnatural presence and the heavily pressurized void of the silent, dead house. The intense, unbearable strain on my burning, dry, wide-open eyes became far too painful to ignore. My vision began to aggressively blur with dark, heavy spots, the stinging tears of pure terror pooling thickly in the corners of my vision. Acting entirely on pure, frantic, desperate human reflex, I forcefully broke eye contact for just a fraction of a single second, heavily and agonizingly blinking my heavy eyelids to clear the stinging moisture. It was a microscopic, deeply insignificant break in my visual focus, a completely involuntary curtain of absolute darkness that lasted no longer than a single, rapid, frantic heartbeat. But when my heavy eyelids violently snapped back open, and I instantly snapped my terrified gaze back toward the dark threshold of the bedroom, the doorway was completely, entirely empty. A sudden, massive wave of pure, disorienting relief washed over my exhausted body for exactly one half of a single, fleeting second, before the terrifying, absolute, paralyzing truth violently slammed into my chest like a heavy sledgehammer. The towering, pitch-black figure hadn't vanished into thin air, and it absolutely hadn't retreated into the dark sanctuary of the bedroom. It was closer now. It was standing less than 5 feet directly in front of me in the freezing hallway, perfectly still, perfectly silent, its massive, featureless, solid void completely dominating my entire field of vision in the flickering light, patiently waiting for me to finally realize that my safe, quiet home had never truly belonged to me at all.